Because it's 7:30, you're listening to Radio Literature here on WORT 89.9 FM out of Madison, Wisconsin. I am your host for this evening, Jason Compton. Melvin Hinton is away this week. And sometimes when Melvin goes away, it's because he's got something else to do. But this time around, he reached out to me earlier this week and he said, Jason, you don't have to wait until I'm not available if you have something that you want to cover on this week's program. And I said, thank you, Melvin. I will look into that. And a topic that we've only occasionally touched on here on Radio Literature, which if you've been with us for a while, you know is one of the longest, if not the longest continuously running program here on WORT. But being an older program, we don't always deal with new media. And there's really quite a lot of different ways that people have been able to engage with books and readership and other readers in the 50 years or so since WORT went on the air. And every once in a while, I've been able to talk to book podcasters on the show. And knowing that I had this window today, I reached out to a new and rising podcast. It's the Zero to Well Read podcast. And I have the creators and hosts on the air with me tonight, Jeff O'Neill and Rebecca Schinsky. Thank you so much for taking this invitation on short notice.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
So I myself, I'll just pull back the curtain. Knowing that I had this window, I started looking into what are some new, interesting, rising and engaging book podcasts out there, and I did come across yours. So to help fill me in, as well as the listening audience, can you give us just a little bit of background on why this podcast exists?
So we talk about the podcast as a mix of literature class and book club. We're from BookRiot, BookRiot.com, which is the largest independent media organization covering books and reading in the United States. We have a website, we have the podcast, we have a whole bunch of newsletters. And Jeff and I have been hosting the BookRiot podcast together for almost 15 years now. It focuses on news in the world of books and reading. But we've been hearing over the last couple of years from folks who really wanted to go back to being able to engage deeply with the written word and to do it in a way that was fun and less intimidating than what a lot of people felt in the classroom as kids. I think some of this is just stage of life. A lot of it seems to be reaction to technology and that people are not happy with how they feel when they're scrolling in their phones a lot. So they want to use their brains in a different way. Jeff is a former literature professor. I have a background as a book reviewer as well. And we thought that with our powers combined, this is something that would be fun for us and that listeners would like to engage with it as well. So each episode of Zero to Well Read is a deep dive into one book that we consider to be something that you should read if you want to be well read, in terms of both understanding the landscape of like the classic canon, but also contemporary hits, pop culture phenomena, the books that are driving the culture now, and the books that got us to this place.
Now, I want to derail this because when you mentioned being a book reviewer, I realized I have been on a quest for the better part of a third of a century now, because back in high school, I did a project, a paper on John Updike. It involved, Rabbit Run and on his work. And I swear I came across a quote from him while doing that research, my junior year in high school, whatever it was, in which he said that essentially the art and craft of book reviewing is nearly as important as the art and craft of writing, and because he did do both. However, I've been unable to find that quote ever since. Does this ring a bell for either of you?
It sounds like something John Updike might say, because he was a wonderful essay writer and writer about books himself. Maybe if I can backfill what I'm guessing he was meaning, especially in the time that Updike was especially coming to power, 50s, 60s, 70s, in which the book review, and I think this is an interesting way of thinking about what podcasts do differently and similarly to a book review, that was the currency of discussing books. There's academic discourse, but for regular readers, which make up the lion's share of the book market, to the point of 15 years ago, Rebecca, I would say, the book review, especially the New York Times book review, was the thing. That's how people engage with public discourse about book. When we started BookRiot 15 years ago, there were so many book reviews in other places, and then the rise of things like Goodreads, that we decided not to do book reviews at all because we felt that space was pretty well saturated. That was covered, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The irony, of course, is now book reviewing has really disappeared in sort of a conventional way. I was reading an article the other day that there's 5 professional book reviewers left in the United States. There's a lot of freelancers and contributors, but people who make their monthly rent and mortgage or whatever from book reviewing is gone. What I think Updike is getting to is something that we are getting to in this show, which is there are so many books. There's so many wonderful books. And in a way that's sort of unlike other cultural documents or other cultural fields, any new book really does compete with every book that's come out before. A reader has, just as much of an incentive to pick up The Great Gatsby today as they do to pick up something like, say, The Correspondent by Virginia Evans, which is selling very well. It's new in hardcover, but it's a more of a front list, meaning new kind of title. Movies and music do that to some degree, but books really are different. You go into the bookstore and you go to the fiction section, and they're all just there, alphabetized. They're sort of flattened out. And I don't know if your listeners know this, there were 4 million books published last year. 4 million titles that got unique ISBNs. And the average American reads about 12 books a year. So that is a lot of winnowing and gatekeeping you need to do, or individual reader needs to do, to get from the whole wide blue sky to here's the one particular cloud I'm going to focus on today. And so I think what Updike was trying to say, or at least that's how I would interpret it, is that helps readers find books and think about them, how to understand and interpret them, because it's hard to do by yourself. You pick up a book of any kind, especially sort of a classic or something that's trying to do something interesting, it's hard to know on your own what to make of it. You may not be an expert at the field. You may not know anything about that author, their country, their background, and their own sort of literary project. So that's the one thing we try to do, right? Most of the books we've covered, someone's probably at least heard of. Sometimes they haven't, but that's maybe it. And that can be so intimidating to be like, I've heard of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. What do I do with it, even if I were to pick it up, because it's strange and naughty and interesting and uncomplicated and has its own publication history. So there's so much interesting work that can be done sort of as to help people pick out what book to read, how to understand it, and how to integrate it into their own understanding of the world.
You're mentioning Goodreads and that stat I was not aware of just how few professional book reviewers there are left. Right. But the Goodreads thing in particular, because I feel like Goodreads came out of that movement, say 20, 25 years ago. Citizen reviewing, that's what matters. Get the star ratings, from people like you and the curated algorithms and all that. So is having a book review / book club podcast, is that kind of a reaction in some way to the limitations of kind of crowdsourced reviewing?
I think it's both a reaction to the limitations of it and really a desire to present critical conversation about books in a way that is more accessible. Like, we're really trying to thread the needle between the ivory tower approach that traditional book reviewing used to take. It still takes it, but like a lot less than it did 15 years ago. The internet has really pushed mainstream journalism and mainstream book reviewing to cover a wider array of books and to reach more readers. Goodreads, I think, was originally popular because of that folks, if you weren't reading like serious literary fiction, you didn't have a place to learn about what other people who liked the kinds of books that you liked were reading. If you were into young adult or romance or mystery thrillers, and Goodreads gave folks a place to connect around that. We think that's a really important part of the literary landscape for people just to be able to say, here's what I liked, here's what I didn't like. Goodreads reviews range from, like very basic, I liked it, I didn't like it, into more critical kinds of analyses. And we want to stand in the place that's kind of right in the middle of that says, like, here is a book that's important for some reason. We do believe that there's a kind of objectivity that we can bring to these things, but then also to talk about what did it feel like to us to read it? What's the context for reading that book right now? Why was it originally important and why does it remain important? Or for relatively newer titles like James by Percival Everett, for example, why was it important the moment it came out 2 years ago? And why do we believe that it will continue to be important? So there is we've always talked about BookRiot's writers as kind of expert amateurs. And I think that positioning is what really helps us to connect with our readers, where, we're more plugged in and doing this work more deeply than a casual reader is, but we're also not coming to them from a kind of ivory tower positioning.
Okay. So I'm going to say some words about the podcast and you correct me because you know more about it than I do. So 0 to well read, is this kind of a stealth reference to like the couch to 5K concept? You're not well read, but you want to get there and we're going to help you get there.
Oh, it might actually, I'd have to Google when Couch to 5K arose, but this for us comes out of a post that Jeff wrote on BookRiot way back in the day, maybe 2011 or 2012. It was a weird
thought experiment. If I remember, the idea was, like, let's say you got dropped into the moment in time I was writing, I think 10 or so years ago, and you'd never read a book in your life and you wanted to be well read. What would be the 100 books that would get you farthest towards that? I think Rebecca and I both think it was well read as both real and impossible as a moniker. It's kind of like the end of the rainbow. Like you can drive towards it, but you're never really ever going to get there.
Yeah, I've been saying it's the journey, not the destination.
Yeah. And so the idea of zero to well read is like, you can start kind of anywhere. You don't need to start with the Iliad or the Epic of Gilgamesh. You certainly could do a more historical approach, but you can kind of start anywhere. And there are so many different books that can fill your well-read bucket. The kind of books we cover range from, we have done Oedipus the King, so all the way back to antiquity, to Project Hail Mary and Twilight, something that's current. The movie came out. We love that book. We think it's a fun reading experience. We think Andy Weir's a really fun author, really smart person. And we want to engage with all kinds of books that people may have some reason to care about. Sometimes that might be sort of rubbernecking, like cultural rubbernecking, to look at Twilight if that's not your cup of tea. But also it could be cultural rubbernecking if it's Shakespeare and you've never gotten into Shakespeare before. So, we think of being well-read as a really embracing term, but it's also a real one, right? That you do something besides just have your eyes move over the words. You think about it, you engage with it, and then you try to connect it with other things either in books and literature or the wider world. So, I think there's no one I know that's read everything. And even those that consider themselves well-read will admit to enormous gaps in their readings or forgettings or incomplete understandings. And any particular reader can start today. It's like, this is something I care about, to engage with ideas and language and art and history in a serious and real way. That can start today, and it can start with one book. And, it's kind of like people say, as soon as you start writing, you're a writer. As soon as you start reading in this way, I kind of think of yourself as on the way to being well-read. We're all going to be fellow travelers together.
Yeah, I think that fellow travelers point is really important. Like, we are doing this work alongside our listeners. We might be a little further down the road than some of them are, but some of them are older than us and have been reading longer than we have, and they have probably read more books than we have. So we have these discoveries with each other as well, where we've covered books that, like, Jeff has read many times, but that I had never read, or vice versa. One of us knows more about a title than the other one does, and we're able to each of us model at different times being the expert in something and being the beginner to a book. And I think that also gives listeners multiple points of entry, whether they identify closer to the zero end of the spectrum or the well-read end.
Okay. And it's a weekly show? Yes, that's a cadence that you're...
It is weekly.
New episodes every Tuesday.
We don't announce the titles ahead of time. That's sort of the fun, to open your podcast player. You can get it wherever podcasts are available and see what it is. Another thing that's interesting, I think, for people to think about is we don't really expect people to listen to the show in any one particular way. There are some people that see what the new episode is and then read the book and then listen to it. Some people listen to it without reading the book first, and then I can read the book later. Some listen to the episode without ever intending to read the book. So that's one of our goals here is, you do not have to have read the book, nor do you need to intend to read the book to get something out of the show, because I think this maybe goes back to the reviewing point before. I don't think many people who fell in love with books and reading fell in love with books and reading because of book reviews. They fell in love with it because of one of two factors: the reading itself, or a great teacher, a great class, a great book club, a great mentor, or a friend or a family member that got them into books and reading. And so I think one thing Rebecca and I want to do for ourselves, selfishly, is to enact these moments of discussion around books. Like, we discover things about these books that we wouldn't have gotten if we'd even read them in the serious way we do them, just by talking about them. We're discovering things together. And I think that is a thing that a conventional review, even sort of in the heyday of reviews, could never really do. And we did reviews because that's what we had. But in the era of podcasts, you can have all kinds of different discussions around books. There are podcasts for any kind of book lover out there. Some are shorter, some are devoted to one author, some are devoted to one book over many, many episodes. We're trying to find a place that we kind of trying to make the show we would like to listen to. And it's that alchemy of talking together with your friends. But it's not just your friends. Like, you want to be serious about it in the same way, but you also don't want it to be really academic, though there are really academic discussions too. So that's kind of our sweet spot. Like, what kind of book discussions do we want to have? And we enjoy making the show, and I hope it comes through in the episodes.
Yeah, that was something I was going to mention, is that I have seen, and I think we mentioned here, that it's framed in some sense as a book club, but also as a review. And book club, my understanding, I've never been part of one. Mm-hmm. The expectation is that you've read the book before you engage with it. But so my experience researching in preparation for this conversation was I listened to 2 episodes, and I deliberately picked 2 books that I said, okay, those are books that I believe that I should read for different reasons.
And we all know those. I don't know where that comes from, Jason. We just know we should read them. Like, it's just out there in the culture. Isn't that strange?
Well, and you tipped off where I was trying to save this for a big reveal, because the 2 that I chose were The Old Man and the Sea.
Okay.
And Twilight. Okay. So, on different ends perhaps of the spectrum of your reputation and should you read this, but I'm like, yeah, okay, The Old Man and the Sea, I certainly could get to it, and you do highlight just what a quick read and pretty short story that it is. Twilight being the exact opposite. But I found and the episodes do seem to average about an hour and a half, and through the conversation, I did feel like I wasn't missing out by not having read the book in advance, and sort of was equipped with, all right, these are things that I would look for, or ways to kind of help process it if I'm, for example, struggling with the excitement of marlin fishing, or with the excitement of being the beloved of a sparkly vampire, whatever. Good, I've got this framing from the participants on the show to help me get through it. Is that something that's maybe evolved, as you've been at this for the better part of a year into that?
I think it's actually something that's evolved over the 15 years that we've been talking about books with each other. That this is a show that we could not have produced together when we first started BookRiot, but it's a true culmination of like our sensibilities being different. But over the years, we've kind of honed and influenced each other. We have spent like thousands and thousands of hours talking to each other in a decade and a half. And I think that we've really got a sense of like what the other person is going to be delighted by. But we're still capable of surprising each other. Jeff will like launch an opinion at me on a show that is either something I never expected that he would say, or really might shift the way that I thought about the book. We do have these genuine moments of discovery with each other, but I think the book club feeling really comes from the fact that that listeners can hear we do have genuine affection for each other and affection for the project. We're having a good time. Like if I were going to sit down and read The Old Man and the Sea on my own, I'd probably be texting Jeff about it on the side anyway. So I think what we're really doing is having a conversation with each other that we're allowing folks to come into, and we hope that it's welcoming and fun for them.
And I think that's one thing we both like about, we love podcasts as listeners and creators. And one thing that's different about this medium, or can be different about this medium, is it can be so intimate, right? I think at the best moments for our show, listeners feel like, not that they're eavesdropping, because clearly we know, but it feels like an honest, organic, spontaneous conversation about people who care about that thing that listener wants to listen to. And you can find that about Pokemon cards or iPhones or the NFL draft. All of that's waiting for you in the podcast world. And I think that's one thing where the medium itself is so pliable, especially in this day and age where the technology is relatively affordable. We have high-speed internet. We have good cameras and mics. A lot of people can make a good sounding professional sort of quality in terms of the technical part podcast. And then what's really special is that humanness, right? And I don't want to go into the whole AI thing right now, but like I think you do definitely hear 2 people talking together about things people make. And it's literature, if it's anything to me, it's people thinking about the condition of being people. And that is really the subject of human discourse and human connection. And I think even in books that, I should say this, I don't know if we said this before, the goal of this is not for us to say, Twilight is great and The Old Man and the Sea is bad, or vice versa. We're not evaluating this. Like, these things are out there, but we're trying to get something out of it. There's sort of a selfish quality to it, I would say, at the same time, Rebecca. Like, we want to get something out of these for ourselves. And I think the thing that has surprised me, though, Jason, is you're asking for things that have surprised us, is there's something interesting about everything. And most of these books are both weirder and more interesting and different than, if you haven't read them, then you think they are. If you haven't read Twilight, it's different than you think it is. If you haven't read Old Man and the Sea, it's different than you think it is. That may not be better or worse, but it's almost certainly different, because we get these sort of cultural caricatures or stereotypes or sort of received wisdom about these books, authors, and ideas. But when you really get down in the nitty-gritty with them, I think there's a lot more there and more that's different there than people are going to expect. And that's super exciting.
Okay. Now, you said, I think your quote was, we're not evaluating these books, but you do have a quantitative rating system on multiple categories. So can you talk about what those categories are and how they
Rebecca,
came about?
you have to defend my weird
Well, Jeff loves nothing if not to bring some categories to some things. So we do end every episode by giving the book a 0 to well-read score, where we give it, we have five elements of it that we rate on a scale of 1 to 10. And it's things like how relevant are the central questions of the book to today? How easy to read, like how readable is it? I don't have the notes in front of me.
But nerd read cred is maybe
book
the
nerd
most
read cred.
Subjective. Like how much cred do you get for having read this particular book for people who keep score somewhere? I think we all imagine those people are out there. I don't know that they actually exist. So we do give them a score. It's not really best to worst. It's to help readers sort of contextualize, but also help them pick, right? If it's some readers are much more comfortable with difficult, harder, quote unquote, to read books. So if it's a 1 or 2 on readability, that also signals to people that aren't as interested in that, maybe that's not for them. If they're like, we also have one called the oh damn factor, which is just, wow, I didn't know books could do that. Right. So that gives some, so it's really about orientation relative to other books rather than a hierarchy, though some books score higher than others. And unsurprisingly, it's what's the highest score we probably had so far? Like Hamlet, Rebecca, I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to beat Shakespeare.
Yeah, hard to beat Shakespeare.
I was going to ask if there was a running tally of the score somewhere. Are you waiting for the fan wiki to do that? I'm not seeing it.
Oh, that's a great idea. We should do it. I should add it to our spreadsheet, what the scores were. I would actually guess that because of the caliber of books that we're talking about, the total scores are probably pretty similar across the board. It's how they vary on the readability or that, like the surprise factor that's really useful. So we're not actually that interested in the total 0 to well-read score as we are in, as Jeff was saying, helping folks who are listening try to decide, is this a book that they want to go read? Like, is it worth it to you to go back to The Great Gatsby if you haven't touched it since high school?
Yeah, I agree that maybe the aggregate scores aren't as interesting, but I think looking at those individual categories, the ODAM, that maybe not so much the cred, but the, what are the questions, how much does it speak to questions that are relevant? I think actually, because just in listening to Twilight versus Old Man and the Sea, the discourse around it too, like, this is bigger than you would think, and because of this, is it, can it be a 10? Well, it can't be a 10 because it's not the Bible, but it could be, it could be this, like those discussions.
I think that's a great point, Jason, is when we're thinking of the score for each of those categories, it's more like trying to figure, like our discussion of like how to put it on that scale is more interesting to us than the score, right? You can, like, it may be some indicator of how much we kind of don't care about the score is that we don't collect them. We sort of don't remember. It's really the discussion in the moment that we find interesting.
Yeah.
And speaking of that discussion, so you are the fixtures on each episode. You do sometimes have guests. The Twilight episode had a couple of guests, and I was actually pleasantly surprised that I was, I kept track of who everybody was, even though two of these people I had no background in coming in. Is that just a sort of game time decision? Is it something where if a book just doesn't speak to either of you in quite the way that you feel like you've got all the information you need, you reach out to others? What's the format there?
It's really that our editorial bench is deep and talented at BookRiot. Our coworkers are so knowledgeable. And so the folks that you heard on the Twilight episode are our other BookRiot editors. Kelly Jensen is a young adult expert, a former librarian, and Vanessa Diaz is a former bookseller, is BookRiot's current managing editor. She's been with us a long time. And she also just loves that reading experience. So we're always thinking about what's going to make this conversation interesting and fun. And Kelly can provide context that we could have Googled our way to, but that she knows in her bones about the impact of a young adult book like Twilight. Vanessa is a great hang and always has smart and interesting things to say. So we try to grab our colleagues in for conversations that we know they're going to be interested in. Our editorial director, Sharifa Williams, had recently read The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson and said it was the best nonfiction book she had ever read a couple months before we recorded our episode on that book. So we brought her in for that. And most recently, we did bring in our first outside WORT-FM guest, Professor Laura McGrath. She's a literary historian and an English professor at Temple University. And she came on to our episode about The Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri and provided just incredible background about the publication history of that book. It was one of only, I think, 7 short story collections that have ever won the Pulitzer for fiction. It was the first paperback original to do that. And these were all things that just, we would have had a different, enriching conversation about the book without Laura, but that she provided really interesting context for us.
And yes, just for listeners out there, if you are interested in following Zero to Well Read, you can search your podcast player. Most phones come with them by default, whether it's Apple Podcasts or the YouTube Music app or one of others that may have shipped on your phone. Otherwise, you can find them in your phone's app store. BookRiot.com, probably the best way to get the links, or if you want to engage with it that way. I know you said that you don't announce the books in advance, so I don't know if it would be telling to share any of the titles that you are hoping to cover in the time ahead. And then my other question as well would be, podcast is still relatively new and in a growth mode, but has there been an episode that maybe drew a larger audience or a different audience to the podcast than you had expected when you pushed publish on the system?
Sure. I'll take those in reverse. Sure. The Secret History by Donna Tartt was one of our most popular episodes. We dropped that one last fall, sort of in the middle of our first season. That's a huge reader cult classic, but it really had a surge of downloads, and it's been one of the most popular episodes to date. The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler was also one of those that we were pleasantly surprised, because that book was not recognized in the way that it should have been when it was first published, but came to prominence in the early 2020s. So it was fun to see that sort of late-breaking reader enthusiasm for Butler is still there. The Great Gatsby episode is popular. The Hamlet episode is popular. You can kind of map them against the books that folks are going to be most familiar with. We do have upcoming episodes. I'll tease just a couple on Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. That's a fascinating story about how that book became a big hit. Tiny book from a nonprofit publisher about Indigenous American practices and botany, but has been a bestseller to the tune of almost 4 million copies. And we're also then going in a totally different direction and talking about The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky, so the great millennial nostalgia teenage pick.
One we've been teasing for months now, because it's going to be a big book of the summer because of the movie coming out, is The Odyssey. Of course, Homer's epic. There's a Christopher Nolan movie coming out. That's one thing we like to do as well. We did a Wuthering Heights episode in anticipation of that movie coming out. So books that are in the discussion for some reason, movie adaptations can be one of them. We also done sort of anniversary episodes or things like that. But when someone, if there's a reason for someone to care about a book that might be considered a classic or something they may have heard about already, we're like, what can we provide a reader to make them have a more interesting, enriching experience of reading and being, a student of culture and history in the world?
Okay, we have just about 30 seconds left. So as longtime observers and participants in the book industry, anything that you just want to share about where you see things going and how our listeners can help follow those 4 million books that are coming out each year?
Well, I did just see news this morning that there are more independent bookstores in the country now than there were 5 or 6 years ago. So the literary landscape is, while it's constantly in flux, it is more robust, I think, than many people think, especially with headlines about the declines in reading for pleasure. And there are just always more books available to us than anyone can ever get to. So I think it's still a thriving landscape.
All right. So my thanks to Rebecca Schinsky and Jeff O'Neill from the Zero to Well Read podcast. I have been Jason Compton. Thank you for listening to us on another episode of Radio Literature.